About how to do a cut. And I'm not going to repeat steps that we've already talked about, but we know that identifying is very important, and I think we've given you some tools to learn how to identify, and I know that it's a bit nerve-wracking to start to do that, but get out there and start to take some pictures, send them our way. We can try to help identify it that way, but I think the more that you get into it, the more confident you'll be, or attend a community cut as well. So we'll try to put those all on the website. So identifying, we've talked about. We've talked about creating a community group, and I think those are good additions. We've talked about mapping. I'm going to talk about some of these other steps, but I guess I wanted to show you, I think David already showed you this, but this was a cut in Honey Harbor again. So this was a before, and a community group cut that out, and that's an after. Now next year, they'll have to come back and see. I would expect there would be a lot less growth, but they'll have to, do another cut to keep it going. So I want to talk a little bit about planning, and I do have these steps on the website, and I think I've given you the link. But important thing is to obviously plan a date. So if you can do one really great thing is to get, whether it's 2 people or whether it's 5 people, but plan a date, or whether it's 15, do a cut somewhere. And it's really important, the timing of the cut. It needs to be done mid-July to mid-August, and that's for the reasons that I think I spoke about before. That's when the energy, or a lot of the energy, moves from the root system up into the plant to try to get it to seed, so that the roots are, in theory, much weaker. So when we talk about how we're going to cut them off and try to drown them as much as possible, it makes them a bit weaker, so that next year you won't have as much growth. And you also don't want to do it when the seed heads are kind of prolific, because then you're just kind of spreading seeds everywhere, and that doesn't work. Part of planning, and this is a big one, is kind of estimating your people resources. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an estimate that I've put out there, and I would love to hear about what you all think. Prioritized stands we've talked about, and then we're going to talk about disposal. So this is kind of based on my own experience, and it depends again on what the tools are. So we were doing hand pruning, so I didn't have any fancy still with me or any of the equipment that you have, which would probably make it a little less intense. But I said that to cut a stand that is about 3.5 meters square, 12 feet square, you probably need about 4 adults or whatever equivalents, providing you have the right waivers signed off of multiples in children and teenagers. And I said, once you've recruited all these people, it could take about 4 hours to kind of do the cut. So that is my estimate. So disposal, I got to be honest with you, is an issue, and I found this out and did not plan it out last year when I did my cuts. So let me say a few things. Is municipalities, as far as I know, in Georgian Bay, they do not have dedicated invasive plant quarantine. Some of them are here, and we hope to continue to talk to the municipalities, and that's why we've invited as many as we can, and we're going to keep doing that. But there isn't a good way that they're managing the disposal of the cut stock, so we do probably need to talk about that. The other part of this is composting is not recommended due to the high probability that this will actually spread the plant. Because they don't really degenerate that quickly. So then what do you do? I will be honest with you, I did not plan this well at all last year. So I had about 20 bags of Phragmites. 10 of them another community member took, and then I took, I should say, it was way more than 10, maybe 10 to 15 bags for myself. And I thought, oh, no problem, I'll burn these every day, it'll be a simple process. Well, it isn't, because Phragmites is a very wet plant. That's part of its problem, is it sucks up the water and actually makes wetlands drier. So part of this is understanding or being able to distribute among your community members all of the stalks and having a place to figure out how to dry them out. So in my particular case, I put them after a while when I found out they weren't drying out, and I tried very miserably to put them on a small beach fire and do 1 bag at a time. wasn't working very well. I spread them out in a really sort of empty space where there wasn't going to be a lot of wind to dry them out. Lynn has recommended that if you do that, you lay them end to end. But this, I will fully acknowledge that this is not an easy process. Hopefully, if you have other members of the community, they can also take this on. But you really do want to kind of identify a place, if you do this, where you can dry them out. A paved area is really excellent as well, because then, and I'm not saying there's going to be escapees because of the nature of the cut that we do, which I'm going to get into. But if there are, you happen to get seeds or little rhizomes in there, you'll be able to see the kind of escapees a little bit easier. Ideally, you want to have the drying space close to the location. Another idea for drying, I have not tried this personally, but is to apply a thick plastic kind of cover over the piled materials to kill the still alive plants. So then we get into the disposal. You can either burn it if it's permitted by bylaws, or sometimes you have to apply for a burn permit, again from the municipality. I think where I am, you're allowed kind of small beach fires if there isn't a fire ban on. I will tell you that was quite onerous, doing 10 bags of that. Another idea is, when they're dried, is finding a spot to bury them. I would say that that's not an awesome idea, but in theory, that is an option. I think the last option is to find a designated spot where you would leave the debris piles. Because in theory, these would not have the seed heads on them, because we've cut them before the seed heads are ready to proliferate. And the way that we do the cut doesn't have the roots or rhizomes. So it's possible, and I'm not saying that this is a great idea, but you can find a designated spot, not anywhere near the water, maybe way back in the deep 40, where you would leave them as a debris pile. Now, these are not optimal. We're hoping to kind of work with the municipalities, that they might find an option. Maybe they would take away, like on a certain couple of days, disposal material. I know in Collingwood, the township worked to haul away their debris from a big cut. I think many of you alluded to this. I think actually you did too. So when you have your community, you really want to give people different roles, and there are different roles to be had. And you want to make sure that you have the right tools. I'm not going to cover everything in here, but one of the most key things is, even from a liability standpoint, is to make sure that you're dressed appropriately. Probably the most important thing is your footwear, like really good sturdy footwear that can go into the water, because when I get into the cuts, there are these little nubs that kind of stick out of the ground. They can be pretty sharp, and so you want to make sure that you have good footwear, that you're okay with going in the water, that a little chute isn't going to kind of burst through. I actually wore a wetsuit from 1972, but it gave me full coverage out there in the sun, and I didn't feel any of the sort of sharp bits of the stalks. Probably good glasses, make sure that you have your sunblock on. Gloves, for sure. Make sure that you have gloves. You want to assign somebody to, do the cutting. So we're going to get into this, but if they're manually cutting, you want to assign people that are cutters. I've heard from other people that actually the hauling requires a lot of manpower. So there's two aspects of that. Is there somebody sort of hauling it from the water as you're cutting it, and trying to catch the debris around. In fact, somebody in one of the communities I talked to had assigned somebody just to kind of wash the perimeter of the water and catch any little bits that they saw. So there's hauling just from the water, and then depending on where your disposal site is, you also have to think about hauling it to kind of what you're doing disposing. Taking them, and there are tools too for hauling. Like a lot of people used windsurf boards in the water to haul things away. You want to have wheelbarrows. You want to think about those kinds of things. Burn barrels are an option that I wish I had thought about last year, but if you're doing it slowly, I think a burn barrel might be an interesting option after you've dropped it off, dried it out. Make sure that you have brushes when you're done to kind of brush yourself off and your equipment, maybe even a change of clothes, because you don't want to have these little specks on you and take them to another area. So now we're just going to get into the cut, and I think one of the most important things to do is to take a before photo so that you can feel really great when it's done and you can show us what you've done. A lot of it is actually even about monitoring this stuff. I'm going to skip to the third point, which is seed heads. So if perchance there are seed heads when you're going to cut, I would suggest going in and snipping them off as best you can. And I mean, even if that's the only thing you do, it's somewhat helpful in Phragmites removal, but cut the seed heads off and put them right into a paper bag. And then what you want to do is sort of start working from the edge and work inwards in terms of cutting down these Phragmites stalks. So the way that I did this was you want to cut the stalk just above the sediment level. So be kind of close together like this. So let's say the water is here. You got to reach down into the water and try to go as deep as you can and just cut it just above the sediment level. And then I think we've talked about collecting, disposing, and storing, cleaning the equipment, and make sure you take an after photo. We'd be happy to distribute all of these things to, part of it is sharing successes. So now the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is on beaches. So in this particular instance, I mean, you can just do the above sediment level, and that's okay. But one of the things that you might want to consider that might be more effective, and I'm talking about soft substrates, is using a very sharpened spade. And this is where you don't cut too deeply. Maybe this is not such an awesome picture of a Phragmites, but just before it hits the rhizome level, and David already talked about this, but you go in on an angle with the spade, with the very sharp spade, and it just cuts it. And then you pull the stalk out of the soft substrate, and then you put it in. So, and you follow the same process as the in-water process. So as the last thing, I do want to talk about the commitment. And Catherine, I think, has said that it's definitely more than 2 years. But it is a commitment. You are going to have to monitor the site next year and probably the year after. That's just the one site. And you're also going to have to keep vigilant for new sites. So it's always about recruiting people, about making sure that you go back and check your old sites, mapping new sightings, and eventually we will honestly get this under control. Share your success stories, I think, is a big one. So this is just as maybe some inspiration. This was kind of a youngish Phragmites stand we saw before July. I got my community group together, and there were way more than this. I had some of my teenagers working on it, but we tackled it, and it's from a different perspective. But all of this was kind of Phragmites, and I'll be interested to go back this year and see, how many actually pop up. This was one that was done again in my bay, and kind of a small young stand, and that's what it looks like after. Like, you can tell that is going to come back at some point and bring back some real native biodiversity. So in summary, I would say you really need to have the right plan for the right situation. Remember to map, assess, plan, and I think the most important thing is just do something. Anything that you do is going to be positive for the Phragmites fight. And consider ramping up your efforts and repeating next year. It does kind of get addictive. There's a whole Phragmites expert community out there, or people who have been involved in it a long time, and they're really great people. And finally, spread the word about invasive Phragmites.